The morning in St. Lydian began as gently as any other late summer morning in the English countryside. A mild golden sunlight lay across the hedgerows, and the village green hummed quietly with the pleasant preparations for the annual charity garden gathering at Rosebank House. White folding tables had been arranged beneath the apple trees, their branches heavy with fruit that gave off a faint, sweet scent in the warming air. Teapots, cake stands, and carefully folded linen napkins stood waiting in quiet order, as though the day itself had been politely invited to participate. Miss Jane Marple sat comfortably in a wicker chair near the edge of the garden, her knitting resting lightly in her lap. From her position she could observe nearly everyone without appearing to do so, which was a circumstance she had always found rather useful. Her pale blue eyes moved gently across the scene as villagers arrived one by one, greeting each other with smiles that were perhaps just slightly too warm. Mrs. Dalrymple, the vicar's energetic sister, fluttered from table to table directing the volunteers with cheerful authority. Near the rose arbor, Alan Weatherby, whose family had owned half the surrounding farmland for generations, stood speaking quietly with a tall, dark-haired gentleman whose presence had already stirred a mild ripple of curiosity through the village. That gentleman was Lord Henry Whitcomb, a diplomat whose name had recently appeared more than once in the London newspapers. The villages of St. Lydian did not often host figures whose work touched the affairs of governments and treaties, and his arrival had lent the gathering an air of faint importance. Miss Marple noticed, however, that Lord Whitcomb did not appear entirely comfortable. Though he smiled when addressed, there was a tightness about his shoulders that suggested a man who carried some private burden. "You see it too, I imagine," said a voice beside her. Miss Marple turned to find Dr. Leonard Bryce settling into the neighboring chair. The village doctor removed his hat and wiped his brow lightly with a handkerchief. "See what, doctor?" she asked pleasantly. "That fellow Whitcomb. Looks as though someone has placed a stone in his shoe and told him he must walk politely all the same." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she resumed knitting. "Yes," she said thoughtfully. "A man who expects trouble often carries himself that way." Across the lawn, laughter suddenly rose as plates of scones were set out and several children darted between the tables. The scene was perfectly charming, the sort of gentle village festivity that could easily have belonged to any quiet English summer, and yet Miss Marple's eyes drifted again toward Lord Whitcomb. He had stepped away from the crowd now and stood beneath one of the old apple trees. From the pocket of his coat he withdrew an envelope, thin, pale, and already creased from being handled too often. He looked at it briefly, his expression tightening. Then he slipped it back inside his coat, just as Mrs. Dalrymple approached him with determined hospitality. Miss Marple did not stare. That would have been quite improper, but she noted the gesture carefully. "Letters," she murmured to herself, "such small things, and yet they can cause extraordinary disturbances." Dr. Bryce raised an eyebrow. "Bad news. Sometimes worse than bad news," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Secrets." The garden party unfolded pleasantly enough for the next half hour. Tea was poured. The vicar offered a short speech about community spirit, and Mrs. Dalrymple insisted that everyone sample her apricot sponge, yet beneath the polite conversations something faintly uneasy seemed to stir. Lord Whitcomb spoke to several guests, though always briefly. At one point he was joined by Captain Adrian Wells, a retired intelligence officer who had moved to St. Lydian the previous winter and whose quiet manner concealed a sharp and observant mind. The two men spoke in low tones near the far hedge. Miss Marple could not hear their conversation, but she noticed the way Captain Wells's expression changed as Whitcomb spoke, first attentive, then distinctly troubled. Moments later the captain glanced around the garden as though checking whether anyone was watching. Miss Marple lowered her gaze to her knitting at once. It was a habit she had developed long ago. Shortly afterward, Lord Whitcomb excused himself from the gathering, claiming he wished to walk briefly along the orchard path before the afternoon speeches began. No one thought much of it. Village gatherings, after all, were long affairs, and guests frequently wandered through the surrounding gardens. Miss Marple alone seemed faintly thoughtful. Nearly 20 minutes passed. The guests had begun preparing for the small raffle when a sharp cry suddenly cut across the peaceful lawn. It came from the direction of the orchard. Several heads turned. Mrs. Dalrymple dropped the teacup she was holding. Dr. Bryce rose quickly from his chair. "Good heavens," he muttered. A young maid from Rosebank House came running toward them. her face pale. "There's a man," she gasped. "Under the apple trees, is not moving." The doctor was already striding across the grass, several villagers following close behind. Miss Marple stood slowly, folding her knitting with careful precision before placing it into her bag. She did not hurry. She had long ago learned that moments of confusion often revealed far more than moments of calm. By the time she reached the orchard path, a small crowd had gathered beneath the shade of the trees. Lord Henry Whitcomb lay on the grass. At first glance it appeared he had simply fallen, but Dr. Bryce knelt beside him, his expression darkening with professional certainty. After a brief examination he stood and removed his spectacles. "I'm afraid," he said quietly, "that Lord Whitcomb is dead." A murmur rippled through the gathered villagers. Captain Wells stared at the body with stunned disbelief. "How?" someone whispered. Dr. Bryce hesitated. "There are signs," he said carefully. "Poison, I believe." The word seemed to settle over the orchard like a cold shadow. Miss Marple said nothing. Her gaze had drifted instead toward the grass beside the fallen diplomat. There, half hidden beneath the edge of Whitcomb's coat, lay the pale envelope he had examined earlier. Someone had stepped on it in the confusion. Its seal had broken, and from the torn opening protruded a single folded sheet marked with 3 small symbols stamped faintly in red wax. 3 crests, 3 nations. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the letter, and though she said nothing aloud, a quiet thought formed in her mind. Such letters, she reflected, were rarely sent without very serious reasons, and even more rarely did they arrive without someone wishing desperately to prevent them from being read. For several moments after Dr. Bryce spoke, no one in the orchard seemed capable of movement. The word poison had a peculiarly chilling effect upon English villagers. A shooting suggested passion, a blow to the head some dreadful impulse, but poison implied patience, secrecy, and intention of a colder sort. The apple trees, which a quarter of an hour earlier had seemed merely picturesque, now cast shadows that looked almost accusatory upon the grass. Mrs. Dalrymple was the first to recover enough to speak, though her voice shook violently. "This is impossible," she said. "At a church charity gathering at Rosebank House, good gracious, what are we to do?" "What we are to do," said Dr. Bryce with forced steadiness, "is send immediately for the police and make certain no one touches anything." That practical instruction, simple as it was, restored a little order. Young Peter Wicks, the gardener's son, was dispatched on a bicycle to the station in Much Benham, while the others drew back uncertainly from the body. Some obeyed out of respect. Others, Miss Marple thought, obeyed because they were relieved to have been told how to behave. Captain Adrian Wells remained nearest to Lord Whitcomb. His face had altered curiously. Shock was there, certainly, but something else as well. Something inward and tight, as though the dead man had left behind not only a corpse but a burden. "You were the last to speak with him, were you not?" asked Dr. Bryce. The captain looked up sharply. "Aye. No, at least not the last. We spoke in the garden, yes. He was disturbed about some matter of business." "Business?" echoed Mrs. Dalrymple, immediately alert. "Political business." Captain Wells's jaw hardened. "I cannot say." That, Miss Marple noticed, was not at all the same thing as saying there was none. Gossip, like mist, began at once to gather. Vera Belling, who possessed a face made for sympathetic listening and a temperament that thrived on other people's disgrace, whispered that such men always made enemies abroad. Mr. Simmons, the solicitor, suggested in a grave tone that foreign intrigue was by no means impossible nowadays. Priscilla Wren, who kept the post office and had a taste for melodrama fed largely by newspapers, declared she had always thought diplomats looked hunted. Miss Marple, standing a little apart, listened to the rising murmur without appearing to do so. She had often reflected that when a serious event occurred, people revealed themselves almost at once in the explanations they preferred. Some longed for romance, some for scandal, some for a version that left their own little world untroubled. Very few wished for the truth if the truth was uncomfortable. Her eyes returned to the fallen envelope. It still lay near Lord Whitcomb's coat, the broken seal exposed now to anyone who cared to notice. Yet nobody had mentioned it. That in itself was interesting. Either they had not seen it, which seemed unlikely, or they were pretending not to see it, which was much more revealing. Miss Marple bent, not to touch the letter, but to retrieve a dropped knitting needle that had slipped from her bag. In doing so, she observed the paper more closely. The folded sheet within had been drawn partly out, as if the dead man had either attempted to read it again, or had meant to show it to someone. One edge bore a faint smear, not of mud, but of something dark and oily, like soot transferred from a glove or a thumb. "Dear me," she said softly. Captain Wells turned at once. "Did you notice something, Miss Marple?" "Oh, only that orchard grass is so deceptive," she said. "It appears clean, and yet it clings to everything." He looked at her for a second longer than politeness required. Then his gaze shifted to the letter, and for the briefest instant his expression changed. It was gone at once, but she had seen it. Fear, Miss Marple thought, was easy to recognize. It nearly always resembled guilt to those who did not understand human nature. By the time Inspector Graves arrived from Much Benham, accompanied by a younger constable with red ears and an air of solemn importance, the whole atmosphere of Rosebank House had changed. Tea cooled untouched upon the tables. Half the village remained gathered in uneasy groups on the lawn, unwilling to leave and equally unwilling to remain too near the orchard. Inspector Graves was a capable man with a square face and a tendency to prefer tidy conclusions. He listened to Dr. Bryce's opinion, examined the body, and then began the business of asking questions with brisk efficiency. Lord Whitcomb had eaten cake, drunk tea, and then walked alone into the orchard. No one admitted to having followed him. No one had seen anyone else go that way. The envelope was finally noticed, at which point the inspector took it up carefully with his handkerchief and frowned at the 3 crests stamped in fading red wax. "What do these signify?" he asked. No one answered immediately. Then Captain Wells said, "Diplomatic markings, I should think." "You think," said the inspector. "I recognize the style, not the particulars." Inspector Graves unfolded the letter and read it in silence. His expression, usually rather stolid, sharpened noticeably. "Well," he said at last, "this is a queer business." Naturally, everyone wished to know why, but he was not fool enough to explain it before an audience. He slipped the paper back into the envelope. "I should be obliged if all present remained available for questioning." Mrs. Dalrymple clasped her hands. "Inspector, surely you don't believe the murderer is here in the village?" Inspector Graves looked around at the assembled faces. "Madam, I believe the murderer was here in this garden within the last hour. As for where that person belongs, we shall discover in due course." The effect of this was immediate and profound. Friends looked at one another with new caution. Conversations broke off unfinished. Even the most innocent faces acquired a strained and private quality. Miss Marple saw Vera Belling move quietly toward Priscilla Wren and begin whispering. Mr. Simmons withdrew into legal reserve. Alan Weatherby lit a cigarette with fingers that were not quite steady. Captain Wells stood very still, watching Inspector Graves with the concentrated attention of a man who expects danger from every question. And then there was Lucia Harrow. She had arrived late to the gathering, and later still to the orchard, summoned from Rosebank House, where she had been helping the housekeeper. She was not, strictly speaking, of the village, though she had been staying for some weeks with her aunt, old Mrs. Fanshawe. Dark-haired, elegant, and markedly self-possessed, she carried herself with the calm of someone long practiced in concealing emotion. Yet when Inspector Graves mentioned the letter, Miss Marple saw a distinct flicker in her face. Not surprise at the death, which all had shown, but surprise of another sort, quick and involuntary. Recognition. It vanished almost immediately. Lucia lowered her eyes and folded her hands. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked gently as she resumed a few absent stitches. Nobody ever suspected a woman knitting of collecting facts. By late afternoon the body had been removed, the garden party abandoned, and St. Lydian had begun the dreadful work of turning a murder into conversation. Curtains twitched. Doors closed more quietly than usual. In shops and front parlors the same names began to circulate, first with caution, then with confidence unsupported by anything at all. Captain Wells had a shadowy background. Lord Whitcomb had enemies. Lucia Harrow looked foreign. Mr. Simmons knew too much. Alan Weatherby had debts. Every life once examined with malice provided material enough. As evening settled over the village, Miss Marple sat by her window with her tea untouched beside her. The lane outside was growing dim, and the first lamps shone softly through drawn curtains. She thought of the broken seal, the dark smear on the paper, Captain Wells's look of fear, and Lucia Harrow's momentary recognition. Then she thought, as she often did, of something entirely domestic, an old housemaid in St. Mary Mead, who had once hidden a butcher's bill inside a hymn book because she feared her mistress would see it. The maid had not been wicked, merely desperate, and desperation had made her clumsy. People, Miss Marple reflected, were much the same whether the secret concerned unpaid meat or the fate of nations. Only the scale changed. The signs did not. She set down her cup and looked out into the deepening dusk with a mild, thoughtful expression. Someone in St. Lydian had been frightened by that letter before Lord Whitcomb ever opened it in the orchard, and someone else, perhaps the very same person, was frightened still. By the following morning, St. Lydian had taken on the peculiar atmosphere that often follows a violent event in a quiet place. The village continued its ordinary routine. Shops opened, the baker delivered his bread, and the church bell rang precisely at 9. But beneath these familiar motions there ran a current of restless attention. Curtains twitched a little more frequently, and conversations dropped abruptly whenever footsteps passed along the pavement. Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to observe such patterns many times, regarded the phenomenon with quiet interest rather than alarm. She sat in the small sitting room of her cottage with her knitting arranged neatly beside her, while the morning light fell softly across the polished table. Her visitor, Dr. Bryce, stood by the window with his hands clasped behind his back. "I must say," he declared, "I cannot recall anything so extraordinary happening here in my lifetime. Poison, and at a garden party." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, it was very inconsiderate of the murderer." Dr. Bryce gave a short, humorless laugh. "Inspector Graves thinks it must have been administered shortly before Whitcomb went into the orchard. Indeed, he examined the tea things, of course, nothing unusual there. The poison, whatever it was, acted rather quickly." Miss Marple resumed knitting with small, precise movements. "And Lord Whitcomb had the letter with him when he died?" "Yes," said the doctor. "Graves has taken it away for examination. Apparently it concerns some matter of diplomatic importance." Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment. "How curious," she murmured. Dr. Bryce looked at her. "Curious? Well," she said gently, "if a man carried such an important letter, it is interesting that he chose to read it again beneath the apple trees rather than in private." The doctor frowned. "You think he expected someone to meet him there?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she set aside her knitting and rose to pour tea from the pot warming on the tray. "I think," she said at last, "that when people behave in ways that appear unusual, it is often because something else has already occurred that we have not yet noticed." Dr. Bryce accepted his cup, though he looked unconvinced. Before he could reply, a brisk knock sounded at the door. The maid admitted Inspector Graves. The inspector removed his hat and nodded politely. "Good morning, Miss Marple." "Doctor." Miss Marple gestured toward a chair. "How nice of you to call, Inspector. Tea?" He accepted with visible relief. "I'm afraid this business grows stranger the more we look at it," he said once he had settled himself. "That is often the way," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. Inspector Graves placed a small notebook on the table. "We've learned a few things about the letter." Dr. Bryce leaned forward immediately. "And it appears to concern negotiations between 3 European governments. Certain agreements, confidential ones. If the contents became public, it might cause considerable diplomatic embarrassment." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Embarrassment is a very powerful motive." "Yes," said the inspector, "but it is not the only one." He glanced briefly at Miss Marple. Lord Whitcomb had received threats recently. Dr. Bryce sat back in surprise. "Threats? Anonymous letters," said the inspector. "Several of them. Our colleagues in London confirmed it this morning." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows mildly. "And yet he carried this final letter with him quite openly." Inspector Graves hesitated. "That is precisely the point that troubles us." He opened his notebook. "There is another matter as well. Captain Adrian Wells." Miss Marple looked up. "Wes?" He admitted under questioning that he knew Lord Whitcomb from years ago. "That seems quite natural," said Miss Marple. "Not entirely. Their acquaintance dates back to intelligence work during the war." Dr. Bryce let out a low whistle. "That complicates things." Inspector Graves nodded. "Captain Wells claims he had no idea Whitcomb would be attending the gathering yesterday, yet several villagers reported seeing them speak privately." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Did Captain Wells explain the conversation?" "He says Whitcomb asked whether they could talk later. That was all." "And do you believe him?" Inspector Graves hesitated. "I believe he is frightened." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, fear can be very instructive." The inspector studied her curiously. "You noticed something yesterday, didn't you?" "Oh, nothing of consequence," she said gently. "But you observed the letter." Miss Marple met his gaze. One does notice small things when one knits quietly at garden parties. Inspector Graves leaned back slightly. "Did you see anyone approach Lord Whitcomb in the orchard?" "No." "Did you notice anything unusual?" Miss Marple considered. "There was a smear on the paper," she said at last. "A dark one." Inspector Graves straightened at once. "A smear?" "Yes, like soot, perhaps. Or oil." "That's interesting," he murmured. Dr. Bryce looked puzzled. "What could that mean?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "It suggests someone handled the letter whose hands were not entirely clean." Inspector Graves scribbled something in his notebook. "Very helpful, Miss Marple." He closed the book with a small snap. "There is one more matter." His tone changed slightly. "The young woman staying with Mrs. Fanshawe, Lucia Harrow." Dr. Bryce raised an eyebrow. "The dark-haired one?" "Yes." Inspector Graves hesitated. "She admits she recognized the diplomatic seals on the envelope." Miss Marple looked mildly surprised. "Does she indeed? She says she worked briefly in a government office in London before coming here." Dr. Bryce frowned. "That seems innocent enough." Inspector Graves did not look convinced. "Perhaps." Miss Marple sipped her tea calmly. "And what do you think, Inspector?" He hesitated. "I think," he said slowly, "that several people in this village knew more about that letter than they admitted." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled very slightly. "That would not surprise me at all." Inspector Graves rose after finishing his tea. "Well, we shall discover the truth soon enough." When he had gone, Dr. Bryce turned to Miss Marple. "You're thinking something, I can tell." Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. "Yes, about the letter? Partly. And the murder also partly." The doctor sighed. "You're going to say nothing, I suppose?" Miss Marple's needle clicked softly. "Not yet." Outside, the quiet lane lay warm under the morning sun, and somewhere a cart rattled slowly over the stones. Miss Marple's thoughts returned once more to the orchard, the broken seal, and the momentary expression she had seen on Lucia Harrow's face. Recognition. That small flicker troubled her far more than the diplomatic seals or the threats from London. For if Lucia Harrow had recognized the letter before it was opened, then it followed that someone in St. Lydian had known it was coming. And if someone had known it was coming, they might also have known exactly why Lord Whitcomb had to die before anyone else could read it. The following afternoon brought a curious heaviness to St. Lydian. The sky hung low and pale, and a thin breeze moved through the hedges with a faint whispering sound that seemed to encourage speculation rather than quiet it. In the post office, in the butcher's shop, and even in the churchyard where Mrs. Dalrymple had taken to walking nervously in the afternoons, the same subject returned again and again: Lord Whitcomb, the poisoned diplomat, and the mysterious letter that now sat somewhere in Inspector Graves's possession. Miss Marple, who believed strongly in the usefulness of ordinary errands, set out along the village lane with a small basket over her arm. She intended to purchase wool at the draper's shop, though she suspected she might also collect something far more valuable information. The village street was lively in that slightly strained way communities often adopt after a shock. People greeted one another warmly but lingered just long enough to exchange the newest rumor before moving on. At the corner near the bakery, Miss Marple encountered Priscilla Wren standing outside the post office door with an expression that suggested she had discovered something extremely interesting. "Miss Marple," Priscilla exclaimed at once. "Have you heard?" Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "My dear, I suspect I have heard very little compared with you." Priscilla lowered her voice with theatrical importance. "They say Lord Whitcomb had enemies in 3 different countries." "How very inconvenient," Miss Marple murmured. "And Captain Wells is involved in intelligence matters," Priscilla continued eagerly. "My cousin in Reading once told me those sorts of men carry secrets everywhere." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, secrets do tend to travel." Priscilla leaned closer. "And that girl Lucia Harrow. I never trusted her look. Too composed by half." Miss Marple gave a small, sympathetic smile, though she said nothing further. She had long ago discovered that encouraging people to talk was far more effective than contradicting them. After a few more minutes of speculation, she continued down the street and entered the draper's shop. The bell above the door chimed softly. Inside, the shop smelled faintly of fabric and lavender sachets. Shelves of wool, ribbons, and neatly folded cloth lined the walls. Behind the counter stood Mrs. Carstairs, who possessed the extraordinary ability to conduct business while simultaneously absorbing every piece of village news. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," she said brightly. "A dreadful business, isn't it?" "Quite dreadful," Miss Marple agreed. While Mrs. Carstairs searched for the requested wool, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to wander idly across the shop window. Through the glass she could see Lucia Harrow walking along the opposite side of the street. The young woman moved with calm assurance, but Miss Marple noticed that she paused briefly outside the solicitor's office, Mr. Simmons's establishment, before continuing on. That small hesitation interested her very much. When Miss Marple left the shop a few minutes later, she did not go directly home. Instead, she followed the lane that curved past Mrs. Fanshaw's house. The elderly widow was seated in her garden, wrapped in a shawl despite the mild weather. "My dear Miss Marple," she called cheerfully, "come in, come in. The whole village has been in an uproar." Miss Marple accepted the invitation readily. "I understand your niece has been quite distressed by the events," she said gently once they were seated. Mrs. Fanshawe sniffed. "Lucia, nonsense. That girl never loses her composure. Always was like that, even as a child." "Really?" "Oh yes. When her parents died, she scarcely shed a tear. Not heartless, you understand, just controlled." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "That must have been very difficult for her." Mrs. Fanshawe shrugged. "She worked in London for years afterward. Government work of some sort. Never explained much about it." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Did she know Lord Whitcomb before coming here?" The old woman frowned slightly. "I don't believe so." That hesitation, though small, did not escape Miss Marple's notice. At that moment, Lucia Harrow herself appeared in the garden doorway. She stopped briefly upon seeing Miss Marple, though her composure returned almost instantly. "Good afternoon," she said politely. Miss Marple smiled warmly. "My dear Miss Harrow, I was just admiring your aunt's roses." Lucia sat down across from them. "The whole village seems to be talking of nothing but the tragedy," she said calmly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "It is always surprising how quickly ordinary life becomes entangled with extraordinary events." Lucia's dark eyes rested on her for a moment. "You think the murderer is someone from St. Lydian?" Miss Marple gave a small shrug. "In my experience, crimes are most often committed by those who have the strongest reasons." Lucia was silent. After a moment she said quietly, "Inspector Graves asked whether I recognized the seals on that letter." "And did you?" "Yes." Her answer came without hesitation. "They belong to diplomatic ministries," she continued. "I saw similar markings during my work in London." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "How interesting." Lucia met her gaze steadily. "You believe that matters?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, my dear, everything matters." For a moment the two women regarded one another in silence. Then Lucia rose. "I'm afraid I must write some letters." She left the garden without another word. Mrs. Fanshawe sighed. "She's always been like that, secretive." Miss Marple watched the doorway thoughtfully. After a few minutes she excused herself and walked slowly back toward the lane. The afternoon had grown quieter now, the village settling into that reflective mood that often follows a shock. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked lazily. Miss Marple paused beside the hedge near the orchard path leading toward Rosebank House. Her eyes moved across the grass where Lord Whitcomb had died. The place looked entirely peaceful again. Yet something about the arrangement of events still troubled her. The letter, Lucia's recognition, Captain Wells's fear, and above all, the curious fact that Lord Whitcomb had brought that dangerous document into a crowded village garden as though expecting someone there to see it. Miss Marple adjusted the handle of her basket and began walking again. A small memory had surfaced in her mind, something Lucia Harrow had said only moments earlier. I must write some letters. Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. For letters, she reflected, were rarely written without purpose. And in a matter involving three nations, even the smallest message might carry consequences far beyond the quiet hedges of St. Lydian. The following morning dawned grey and slightly damp, the sort of English morning that seemed to encourage quiet reflection rather than cheerful activity. In St. Lydian, the atmosphere had grown noticeably more strained. What had begun as curiosity was slowly turning into suspicion. People greeted one another with the same polite smiles as always, yet those smiles now carried a certain caution. Miss Marple sat beside the window of her sitting room with a small writing desk pulled near the light. A half-written letter rested before her, though she had paused several minutes earlier and had not yet resumed. Instead, she was thinking. The letter that had killed Lord Whitcomb, because she had no doubt now that it had continued to trouble her thoughts. A document capable of causing international embarrassment did not simply appear by accident at a village garden party. Someone had ensured it arrived precisely there. The quiet knock at her door interrupted her reflections. When the maid admitted Captain Adrian Wells, Miss Marple looked up with mild surprise. "My dear Captain," she said gently. "How pleasant." He removed his hat slowly, though his expression suggested that pleasantness was not the reason for his visit. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, Miss Marple." "Not at all." He sat down across from her, but did not speak immediately. His eyes moved briefly toward the window as though checking that no one stood outside within earshot. "You observe things," he said finally. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I am an old woman, Captain. Observation is one of the few amusements left to us." He gave a short breath that might have been a laugh. "You noticed the letter yesterday?" "Yes." "And the seals?" "Yes." Captain Wells leaned forward slightly. "That letter should never have been here." Miss Marple's eyes rested calmly on him. "No, it contained information about negotiations between three governments. If its contents were leaked, the consequences could be serious." "I see." He hesitated. Whitcomb was carrying it because he intended to deliver it to someone. Miss Marple's knitting needles resting beside her chair remained still. "To someone in St. Lydian?" she asked gently. Captain Wells nodded once. "That is what he told me." "Did he say who?" "No." Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. "How unfortunate." Captain Wells's voice lowered further. "Miss Marple, if that letter falls into the wrong hands—" "My dear Captain," she interrupted softly, "it already has." The words seemed to settle heavily in the room. For a moment he said nothing. Then he spoke again. "Do you suspect someone here?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "I suspect human nature." Captain Wells looked at her with growing frustration. "That's not very helpful." "On the contrary," she said kindly, "it is extremely helpful." He rose and paced once across the room. "You don't understand the stakes." Miss Marple regarded him calmly. "Three nations, I believe." He stopped walking. "Yes." "And yet," she continued gently, "Lord Whitcomb chose to carry this dangerous letter into a public garden party." Captain Wells' expression tightened. "Yes, that suggests," Miss Marple went on, "that the person he intended to meet could not safely be visited elsewhere." The captain looked sharply at her. "You think the recipient lives here?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that Lord Whitcomb expected that person to recognize the letter when they saw it." Captain Wells was silent. After a moment he spoke again, more quietly. "Lucia Harrow recognized it." Miss Marple watched him carefully. "Yes, you noticed that too." "Of course." Captain Wells exhaled slowly. "She once worked in the same department as Whitcomb." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows slightly. "Did she indeed?" "Yes, intelligence liaison." The small room seemed suddenly very quiet. "That is most interesting," Miss Marple said. "She left the service 2 years ago," he continued. "Officially." Miss Marple noted the emphasis on the last word. "Officially." Captain Wells resumed his seat. Whitcomb may have believed she could help him. "Or threaten him," Miss Marple said gently. He looked at her sharply. "You think she poisoned him?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached for her knitting and resumed a slow, steady rhythm. Click, click, click. Finally she spoke. "My dear Captain, if Lucia Harrow had wished to kill Lord Whitcomb, she would not have needed to wait for a garden party full of witnesses." Captain Wells frowned. "Then who?" Miss Marple looked thoughtfully toward the window. "I believe," she said slowly, "that Lord Whitcomb made a very human mistake." "What sort of mistake?" "He trusted the wrong person." The captain leaned forward. "You know who it is?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Not yet." Before he could reply, another knock sounded at the door. Inspector Graves entered with a serious expression. "Ah," he said upon seeing Captain Wells. "Good, I hope to find you both." Miss Marple poured another cup of tea. "Inspector, how nice." Graves remained standing. "We've received confirmation from London regarding the poison. Dr. Bryce's earlier theory had been correct." "It was administered in liquid form," the inspector continued. "Very concentrated. Likely added to a drink." Captain Wells looked startled. "But Whitcomb drank tea with everyone." "Yes," said Graves, "but not only tea." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "Ah." Inspector Graves glanced at her. "You remember the lemonade table near the orchard path?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. We found a second glass there this morning." Captain Wells stiffened. "A second glass, yes." Inspector Graves' voice lowered. "And it contains traces of the poison." The room fell silent. Miss Marple slowly set her knitting aside. "How very curious," she said softly. Inspector Graves watched her carefully. "Why curious?" Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Because," she said calmly, "that means Lord Whitcomb did meet someone in the orchard after all." Captain Wells leaned forward urgently. "You know who?" Miss Marple looked at both men with quiet thoughtfulness. Outside the window, the grey morning light lay softly across the lane, peaceful and entirely ordinary. Yet behind Miss Marple's gentle expression, several pieces of the puzzle had begun to settle into place. Not all of them, but enough to suggest something far more dangerous than anyone in St. Lydian yet imagined. And somewhere in the village, the person who had shared that second glass of lemonade with Lord Whitcomb was beginning to realize that Miss Jane Marple was paying very close attention. The discovery of the second glass of lemonade altered the atmosphere in St. Lydian far more dramatically than the first announcement of poison had done. A poisoning at a garden party might be imagined as some distant intrigue that had wandered accidentally into the village, but the knowledge that Lord Whitcomb had stood privately with someone beneath the orchard trees made the matter uncomfortably close. It meant that the murderer had spoken with him, perhaps even smiled at him. By late afternoon, Inspector Graves had begun calling upon several of the guests again, and word of this spread rapidly through the village. Curtains twitched. Doors opened cautiously when footsteps approached, and people began remembering details they had not considered important the day before. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had taken her knitting into the small garden behind her cottage. She sat beneath a climbing rose whose petals had begun to fall onto the gravel path like pale confetti. From there she could hear the distant hum of the village road, and occasionally the faint sound of voices drifting over the hedges. She was not thinking about poison. She was thinking about lemonade. In her long life, Miss Marple had attended more church fêtes, garden parties, and charitable teas than she could reasonably count. Lemonade, she knew, was rarely served individually. It was placed in jugs or glasses along a table where guests helped themselves freely, which meant that if 2 glasses had been found near the orchard, someone had carried them there deliberately. She was still considering this when footsteps sounded at the garden gate. Lucia Harrow stood there. For a moment, the younger woman seemed almost uncertain, as though she had debated whether to come. "Miss Marple," she said at last. "My dear Miss Harrow," Miss Marple replied warmly. "Do come in." Lucia entered the garden and sat in the chair opposite her. Her usual composure remained, but there was a tension about her eyes that had not been there before. "You are very observant," Lucia said quietly. Miss Marple continued knitting. "Old ladies often are." Lucia studied her. "You noticed that I recognized the seals on the letter?" "Yes, and you believe that means I knew Lord Whitcomb would be here?" Miss Marple did not immediately answer. Instead, she adjusted the wool in her hands. "My dear," she said gently, "I believe it means you were not surprised by the letter." Lucia exhaled slowly. "That is true." Miss Marple looked up. "Would you like to explain?" For a moment, Lucia seemed to weigh something carefully in her mind. Finally, she spoke. "Lord Whitcomb wrote to me 3 days before the garden party." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "He said he would be coming to St. Lydian, and he said he was carrying something extremely important." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "The letter?" "Yes." Lucia's voice lowered. "He believed someone was trying to steal it." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. "Did he say who?" "No, and yet he brought it here anyway." Lucia gave a small, bitter smile. Whitcomb had a weakness for dramatic gestures. Miss Marple resumed knitting. "He hoped the person following him would reveal themselves." Lucia looked surprised. "You understand that? My dear, men with secrets often believe that danger will force the truth into the open." Lucia leaned forward slightly. "He asked me to meet him privately during the garden party." Miss Marple's hands grew still again. "In the orchard?" "Yes. And did you meet him there?" Lucia hesitated. "No." Miss Marple watched her quietly. "We did not go? I changed my mind. Why?" Lucia's gaze moved briefly toward the hedge as though recalling something unpleasant. "Because I saw someone else already speaking with him." Miss Marple's eyes lifted. "Who?" Lucia shook her head slowly. "I couldn't see clearly from the house, but you recognized the figure." Lucia was silent. Then she said quietly, "Yes." Miss Marple waited. Lucia's voice dropped even lower. "It was Captain Wells." The garden seemed suddenly very still. Miss Marple resumed knitting with deliberate calm. "That is interesting." "He lied to Inspector Graves," Lucia said. "He told him their conversation happened earlier in the garden." Miss Marple nodded faintly. "Yes." Lucia leaned closer. "I believe Captain Wells met Whitcomb in the orchard and poisoned him." Miss Marple regarded her gently. "Do you?" "Yes. And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "you did not tell Inspector Graves this." Lucia looked startled. "How did you know that? My dear, if you had told him, the entire village would already be discussing Captain Wells's arrest." Lucia leaned back in her chair. For the first time she looked uncertain. "I didn't want to involve myself." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "That is rarely possible in a murder." Lucia studied her carefully. "You don't believe Captain Wells did it?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "I believe Captain Wells is afraid. That sounds like guilt." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said, "fear is simply the result of knowing too much." Lucia's brow furrowed. "Then who poisoned Whitcomb?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the rose petals scattered along the gravel path. "My dear Miss Harrow," she said gently, "when you saw Captain Wells speaking with Lord Whitcomb in the orchard." "Yes?" "Did you see whether they were alone the entire time?" Lucia thought for a moment. "No," she said slowly. "I only saw them briefly." Miss Marple nodded. "That is what I suspected." Lucia leaned forward again. "You think someone else joined them?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "My dear, garden parties are full of wandering guests." Lucia stared at her. "And you know who it was?" Miss Marple smiled. "Not quite." But as Lucia Harrow left the garden a few minutes later, Miss Marple remained sitting quietly with her knitting resting in her lap. She was no longer thinking about lemonade, nor about the diplomatic letter. Instead, she was thinking about something far simpler. During the garden party, there had been only one person moving freely between the lemonade table and the orchard path without attracting the slightest attention. Someone whose presence near drinks would appear entirely natural. Someone everyone trusted. Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. because once one considered that small detail, the entire shape of the crime began to look very different indeed. That evening a thin mist settled quietly over St. Lydian, softening the outlines of the cottages and hedges until the entire village seemed wrapped in a faint grey veil. Lamps began to glow behind curtains, and the narrow lane outside Miss Marple's cottage grew quiet except for the occasional distant sound of a motor car passing on the far road toward Much Benham. Miss Marple sat beside the small fire in her sitting room, with her knitting resting loosely in her lap. She had not made a single stitch in nearly 10 minutes. Her thoughts had moved steadily back through the events of the garden party, examining each moment with the quiet patience that had solved many puzzles before this one. The lemonade table, the orchard path, the frightened diplomat, and the curious behavior of several people who clearly knew more than they wished to admit. The knock at the door came just as she had expected it might. When the maid admitted Inspector Graves, he appeared tired but alert, his coat still damp with evening mist. "Good evening, Miss Marple." "My dear Inspector," she said pleasantly, "do sit down. You look as though you have had a very long day." He sank into the chair opposite her. "That is a fair description." She poured tea for him before he continued. "We've learned something new about the letter." Miss Marple raised her eyes politely. "Yes? It wasn't just embarrassing diplomacy." "Oh?" Inspector Graves leaned forward slightly. "It contained a draft agreement between 3 governments concerning a military alliance. The information was extremely sensitive." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "I see. If that letter had been stolen and published," he continued, "it could have caused serious international tension." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And so someone wished to obtain it before Lord Whitcomb could deliver it." "Exactly." Inspector Graves hesitated before adding quietly, "London believes a foreign agent may have been involved." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That would certainly be the most exciting explanation." The inspector frowned. "You don't agree?" "My dear Inspector," she said gently, "foreign spies rarely poison men at village garden parties while half the parish drinks tea nearby." Inspector Graves considered that reluctantly. "You think the murderer is local?" "I think," Miss Marple said mildly, "that the murderer understood the village very well." Inspector Graves leaned back, studying her carefully. "You have someone in mind?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she asked, "Tell me, Inspector, did you speak again with Mrs. Dalrymple?" "The vicar's sister?" "Yes, yes, of course," he said. "She organized the garden party." "Why?" Miss Marple's needles moved slowly as she resumed knitting. "Because she spent most of the afternoon near the refreshment table." Inspector Graves looked puzzled. "So did several others." "Indeed. But Mrs. Dalrymple," Miss Marple continued softly, "was responsible for pouring lemonade." The inspector's expression sharpened. "You think the poison was added there?" "I think it is possible." Inspector Graves leaned forward again. "Mrs. Dalrymple has no connection to diplomacy or espionage." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Most murderers do not. But what motive could she have?" Miss Marple's knitting stopped again. "My dear Inspector, when people commit crimes of this sort, the motive is very rarely international politics." The inspector waited. Miss Marple looked toward the window where the mist had thickened against the glass. "More often," she continued quietly, "the motive is something far more ordinary." "Such as?" Miss Marple's eyes returned to him. "Money." Inspector Graves frowned. Whitcomb had no connection to her finances. "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but someone else might." The inspector sat very still. "You believe someone persuaded her to do it?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Or frightened her?" Inspector Graves rose and began pacing slowly across the room. "There's something else," he said after a moment. "Yes. We questioned Captain Wells again this afternoon." Miss Marple looked interested and he admitted Whitcomb asked him about a certain person in the village. Miss Marple waited calmly. Inspector Graves stopped pacing. "Lucia Harrow." Miss Marple did not appear surprised. "And what did Captain Wells say?" "He told Whitcomb she could not be trusted." The small clock on the mantel ticked softly in the silence that followed. Miss Marple resumed knitting. That must have been a very uncomfortable conversation. Inspector Graves nodded. Yes. He hesitated. Whitcomb then went into the orchard to meet her. Miss Marple's hands paused. And Captain Wells did not follow? No. Miss Marple looks thoughtful. That leaves a small difficulty. What difficulty? If Lucia never reached the orchard, Miss Marple said gently, then someone else must have arrived first. Inspector Graves stared at her. You're certain she didn't meet him? Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear Inspector, if Lucia Harrow had poisoned Lord Whitcomb, she would not have come to my garden this afternoon to discuss it. Inspector Graves slowly sat down again. You are remarkably confident. Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly in her lap. Human nature is remarkably consistent. Outside the mist had thickened further, swallowing the hedges and softening the distant lamps along the lane. Inspector Graves watched her thoughtfully. You know who the murderer is? Miss Marple met his gaze. Yes. And you're not going to tell me? Not quite yet. The inspector sighed. You enjoy this part, don't you? Miss Marple smiled kindly. My dear Inspector, solving a mystery is very much like finishing a piece of knitting. How so? One must be quite certain every stitch is in the correct place before casting off. Inspector Graves shook his head but could not entirely hide a reluctant smile. Well, he said, rising again, I suppose you will tell me when the knitting is finished. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled gently. Oh, yes. After he left, Miss Marple remained seated quietly beside the fire. Outside, the village lay wrapped in mist and silence. Somewhere within those quiet houses, the person who had slipped poison into a glass of lemonade was growing steadily more uneasy, because Miss Marple had almost finished knitting together the truth. And when she did, the quiet village of St. Lydian would learn that the murder of Lord Whitcomb had never truly been about three nations at all. The next morning in St. Lydian arrived with a pale, watery sunlight that seemed almost apologetic after the heavy mist of the previous night. The village stirred slowly, though the unease that had settled since Lord Whitcomb's death had not lifted. If anything, it had deepened. People spoke more cautiously now, as though the murderer might be standing just behind the next hedge. Miss Marple rose early as she often did and spent a quiet hour tending to the small flowers in her front garden. The gentle work seemed to help her thoughts arrange themselves properly. By the time the church clock struck 10, she had come to a very firm conclusion. It was not long afterward that she sent a short message to Inspector Graves requesting that he visit her that afternoon. She also sent polite invitations to Captain Wells, Lucia Harrow, Mrs. Dalrymple, and Mr. Simmons, the solicitor, asking if they would kindly call upon her at 4:30 for tea. The invitations caused some mild confusion throughout the village. Nevertheless, at precisely 4:30, Miss Marple's sitting room contained a small but rather tense gathering. Mrs. Dalrymple sat upright near the fireplace with a nervous air of forced cheerfulness. Captain Wells stood beside the window with his arms folded, looking as though he would much prefer to be elsewhere. Lucia Harrow occupied a chair near the small writing desk, her calm expression betraying little. Mr. Simmons sat quietly with his hands resting on his walking stick. Inspector Graves arrived last. He glanced around the room with mild surprise. Miss Marple, he said, this appears to be a rather unusual tea party. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly as she poured tea for everyone. Yes, Inspector, but I find tea most helpful when discussing complicated matters. The group sat in uneasy silence for several moments. Finally, Inspector Graves spoke. I take it this concerns the murder of Lord Whitcomb. Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. Yes. Captain Wells shifted slightly. You've solved it, haven't you? Miss Marple looked at him gently. I believe I understand what happened. Mrs. Dalrymple gave a small gasp. Surely you don't mean someone in this room? Miss Marple's expression remained kind but thoughtful. My dear Mrs. Dalrymple, I am afraid the truth often proves disappointingly close to home. Inspector Graves leaned forward. Well then, perhaps you should begin. Miss Marple nodded. As we know, Lord Whitcomb arrived in St. Lydian carrying a letter of great diplomatic importance. He believed someone might attempt to steal it, and therefore he arranged to meet Miss Harrow privately in the orchard during the garden party. Lucia Harrow inclined her head slightly, but said nothing. Captain Wells, Miss Marple continued, spoke with him earlier and warned him that Miss Harrow might not be entirely trustworthy. Captain Wells looked uncomfortable but did not deny it. Miss Marple continued calmly. Whitcomb nevertheless went to the orchard with 2 glasses of lemonade, expecting to meet Miss Harrow. Inspector Graves nodded. That matches what we know. But Miss Harrow never arrived. Lucia spoke quietly. That is correct. Miss Marple looked toward Mrs. Dalrymple. Instead, someone else approached Lord Whitcomb. Mrs. Dalrymple stiffened slightly. Miss Marple continued gently. That person had easy access to the refreshments table and could prepare a glass of lemonade without attracting the slightest attention. Inspector Graves frowned. You believe the poison was added before the drinks reached the orchard? Yes. Miss Marple turned toward the nervous woman near the fireplace. My dear Mrs. Dalrymple, you poured the lemonade that afternoon. Mrs. Dalrymple's face went pale. Well, yes, but surely you don't think— No, Miss Marple said kindly. I do not believe you intended to kill Lord Whitcomb. The room fell silent. Mrs. Dalrymple looked both relieved and confused. Then what are you suggesting? Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. I believe you were persuaded to carry a glass to the orchard for someone else. Mrs. Dalrymple stared at her. I only took it because Mr. Simmons asked me to. Every head turned toward the solicitor. Mr. Simmons remained very still. Inspector Graves spoke sharply. Mr. Simmons? The solicitor slowly lifted his gaze. This is absurd, he said calmly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not at all. She turned to Inspector Graves. We see Mr. Simmons had something very valuable to gain from that letter. Inspector Graves frowned. What could a village solicitor possibly want with diplomatic secrets? Miss Marple answered quietly. Money. She looked at Mr. Simmons. Several months ago you suffered serious financial losses in certain foreign investments. The solicitor's face remained composed, but his fingers tightened around his walking stick. Miss Marple continued. You learned through your legal contacts that Lord Whitcomb would soon be traveling with a document of great importance. A document that certain foreign governments might pay dearly to obtain. Captain Wells stepped forward angrily. You intended to sell it. Mr. Simmons gave a thin smile. An imaginative theory. Miss Marple shook her head gently. Unfortunately, you underestimated Lord Whitcomb. He suspected someone was trying to steal the letter and hoped the trap he set at the garden party would expose them. Inspector Graves' eyes narrowed, and when Whitcomb walked into the orchard with the letter, Miss Marple finished softly. Mr. Simmons followed him. The room had grown very quiet. Mrs. Dalrymple stared at the solicitor in horror. You asked me to carry that lemonade glass to him. Mr. Simmons said nothing. Miss Marple continued. You had already poisoned the drink. When Lord Whitcomb collapsed, you took the letter from his coat. Inspector Graves spoke slowly. But we found the letter. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, because someone interrupted him before he could leave the orchard. Lucia Harrow spoke quietly. I arrived moments later. Miss Marple inclined her head, and Mr. Simmons was forced to abandon the letter beside the body. Inspector Graves rose slowly. Mr. Simmons looked around the room, his calm finally cracking. You cannot prove any of this. Miss Marple smiled gently. My dear Mr. Simmons, you handled the letter before anyone else. That explains the oily smear we observed on the paper, the same oil used on the hinges of your walking stick. Inspector Graves stepped forward. I think we can examine that rather easily. For several seconds the solicitor said nothing. Then, with a small sigh of resignation, he lowered his head. I underestimated village curiosity. Inspector Graves placed a firm hand on his shoulder. I'm afraid that curiosity is about to become a formal investigation. As the inspector escorted Mr. Simmons from the cottage, the room remained silent. Mrs. Dalrymple sank back into her chair in shock. Captain Wells exhaled slowly. Lucia Harrow looked toward Miss Marple with quiet respect. Miss Marple merely resumed her knitting. Outside, the quiet village of St. Lydian continued its peaceful routines. entirely unaware that a crime involving the secrets of 3 nations had just been solved in a small sitting room over tea. For the next 2 days, St. Lydian lived in a curious state of subdued excitement. News of Mr. Simmons's arrest had spread through the village with astonishing speed, traveling along garden paths, through shop counters, and across teacups until it seemed impossible that anyone could remember discussing anything else. The villagers felt both shocked and oddly vindicated. It was always easier, Miss Marple reflected, when the murderer proved to be someone respectable. There was a certain reassurance in discovering that wickedness wore a familiar face rather than arriving dramatically from foreign shores. Inspector Graves, however, was not a man inclined to close a case simply because it appeared tidy. 2 days after the gathering at Miss Marple's cottage, he returned once again to her sitting room. Miss Marple was knitting by the window when he arrived, her needles clicking softly in the quiet afternoon. "You look thoughtful, Inspector," she said kindly. He removed his hat and sat down with a slow sigh. Thoughtful is one word for it. Miss Marple poured him tea without asking. "Something is troubling you." Inspector Graves accepted the cup, but did not drink immediately. "Mr. Simmons has confessed." Miss Marple nodded gently. "That must be a relief." "Yes and no." Miss Marple waited. The inspector leaned forward slightly. "He admits he intended to steal the letter and sell it to foreign agents. He also admits he poisoned the lemonade." Miss Marple's knitting paused. "But?" she asked softly. Inspector Graves looked at her carefully. "He claims he never actually took the letter." Miss Marple's eyes lifted. "Indeed?" "He says that when Whitcomb collapsed, someone else arrived in the orchard before he could retrieve it." Miss Marple resumed knitting slowly. "That would explain why the letter remained beside the body." Inspector Graves frowned. "Yes, but according to Simmons, that person was not Lucia Harrow." Miss Marple said nothing. The inspector continued. "He insists someone else came along the path just before Lucia arrived." The small clock on the mantel ticked steadily in the quiet room. Miss Marple set down her knitting. "My dear Inspector," she said gently, "Mr. Mester, Simmons is telling the truth." Inspector Graves blinked. "You believe him?" "Yes." The inspector leaned forward. "You mean the murderer is still free?" Miss Marple shook her head calmly. "Oh no, Mr. Simmons certainly poisoned Lord Whitcomb." Inspector Graves stared at her in confusion. "Then what are you saying?" Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "I am saying that the poisoning and the disappearance of the letter were two entirely separate actions." Inspector Graves was silent for several seconds. "You're suggesting," he said slowly, "that someone else took the letter after Simmons fled?" "Yes, and that person has never mentioned it." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Which is very sensible." Inspector Graves stood and began pacing. Who could have reached the orchard in that moment? Miss Marple watched him quietly. There was only one person who arrived immediately after the collapse. Inspector Graves stopped pacing. "Lucia Harrow." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes." The inspector frowned. "But she never reported taking the letter." "Of course not." "Why not?" Miss Marple looked toward the window where the hedges moved softly in the afternoon breeze. "My dear Inspector, Lucia Harrow once worked in intelligence." Inspector Graves stared at her. "You think she took the letter to protect it?" "Yes." "And she never told us?" Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Because she understood that revealing the truth might cause even greater trouble." Inspector Graves slowly sat down again. "She allowed us to believe Simmons had the letter." "Yes." "And she said nothing while we searched." Miss Marple's expression remained calm. "That was probably the safest course." The inspector rubbed his forehead. "So the letter never left the village?" "No." "And Lucia Harrow still has it?" Miss Marple gave a small nod. Inspector Graves leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said after a moment, "that explains several things." "Yes." He looked at her with renewed curiosity. "Why didn't you expose her along with Simmons?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear Inspector, Miss Harrow did not commit a crime. She merely prevented a very dangerous document from falling into the wrong hands." Inspector Graves gave a reluctant chuckle. "You mean she outmaneuvered both the murderer and the police?" Miss Marple resumed knitting. "I believe that would be a fair description." At that moment the maid entered with a small envelope. "For you, Miss Marple." Miss Marple opened it quietly and read the brief note inside. Her smile deepened slightly. Inspector Graves raised an eyebrow. "Good news?" Miss Marple handed him the note. It contained only a short sentence written in careful handwriting. "The letter has been returned safely to its proper authorities. Thank you for understanding." Hellish Inspector Graves read it twice before handing it back. "Well," he said slowly, "that settles that." Miss Marple folded the note and placed it beside her knitting. "Yes." Inspector Graves rose and moved toward the door. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "this case will make an interesting report." Miss Marple looked amused. "I imagine it will." He paused at the doorway. "And Miss Marple?" "Yes?" "You solved a crime that involved 3 governments." Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear Inspector, it was never really about 3 governments." "No?" Her knitting needles clicked softly once more. "It was about human greed, human fear, and a very badly poured glass of lemonade." In the days that followed, the quiet rhythms of St. Lydian gradually returned. The village possessed a remarkable ability to absorb even the most dramatic disturbances and smooth them gently into the fabric of everyday life. Shops reopened with their usual cheerfulness, the church bells rang on Sunday morning as they always had, and Mrs. Dalrymple resumed her tireless management of village events, though she now watched the lemonade jug with rather greater caution. Mr. Simmons had been taken to London under police escort, and the villagers spoke of him with a mixture of disbelief and fascination. It was difficult to reconcile the polite, measured solicitor who had attended parish meetings for years with the man who had attempted to sell diplomatic secrets to foreign buyers. Yet Miss Marple knew such contradictions were not uncommon. Respectability, she often thought, was one of the most convenient disguises in the world. One afternoon, nearly a week after the murder, Miss Marple sat peacefully in her small garden, enjoying the mild sunshine while her knitting rested comfortably in her lap. The rose petals had begun to fall again along the gravel path, and the quiet hum of village life drifted over the hedges. Dr. Bryce arrived through the garden gate carrying his usual air of friendly curiosity. "Well," he said as he settled into the chair beside her, "I imagine the newspapers will have something to say about all this eventually." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I should think they will avoid mentioning St. Lydian if possible. Diplomatic embarrassment and village poisonings rarely mix well in print," the doctor agreed. For a moment they sat quietly. Then Dr. Bryce said, "Inspector Graves tells me the letter has safely returned to the proper authorities." "Yes." "And Miss Harrow left the village this morning." Miss Marple nodded. Lucia Harrow had departed early, taking the morning motor car to the railway station. Her farewell had been brief but sincere. Before leaving, she had stopped by Miss Marple's cottage. "You knew I had the letter," Lucia had said calmly. "Yes," Miss Marple had replied. Lucia had studied her carefully. "You never told Inspector Graves." Miss Marple had smiled gently. "My dear, some matters are better handled quietly." Lucia had given a small nod of understanding. "Whitcomb trusted the wrong people," she had said. "Yes, and you trusted the right ones." Miss Marple had laughed softly at that, though she had not entirely denied it. Now, as she sat in the garden with Dr. Bryce, she reflected briefly on the curious chain of events that had brought international intrigue into their quiet village. "It still astonishes me," the doctor said thoughtfully, "that a matter involving 3 nations could end with a poisoned glass of lemonade at a garden party." Miss Marble's knitting needles moved steadily. "Large affairs often depend on very small moments." Dr. Bryce chuckled. "I suppose that is true." He hesitated before adding, "Tell me something, Miss Marple." "Yes. When did you first realize Mr. Simmons was the murderer?" Miss Marple considered for a moment. "Almost immediately." "Immediately, yes. What gave him away?" Miss Marple looked toward the apple trees visible in the distance beyond the hedges. "My dear doctor, when people commit crimes, they rarely behave quite as they normally would." Dr. Bryce frowned. "That sounds rather vague." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Mr. Simmons always disliked lemonade." The doctor blinked. "I beg your pardon. He mentioned it frequently at village gatherings," Miss Marple explained. "He said it upset his digestion." Dr. Bryce stared at her, and yet he carried a glass into the orchard. Yes. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled softly. That was the moment I began to suspect him. Dr. Bryce leaned back with a long breath. Incredible. Miss Marple resumed knitting calmly. We see people often overlook such things because they seem too trivial to matter. And yet, said the doctor slowly, they matter very much. Yes. For a few minutes they sat quietly while the afternoon sun warmed the small garden. A breeze stirred the hedges, carrying with it the distant sound of children playing near the village green. Dr. Bryce rose at last and brushed the dust from his coat. "Well," he said, "I sincerely hope the next garden party in St. Lydian will be less eventful." Miss Marple laughed softly. "I believe that would be very wise." After he left, she remained seated for a while longer. The village had returned to its usual calm, though the memory of Lord Whitcomb's sudden death would linger in quiet conversations for some time. Miss Marple did not mind that. Such memories she believed to serve a useful purpose. They reminded people that beneath the polite surface of ordinary life there often lay secrets, ambitions, and fears capable of extraordinary consequences. She folded her knitting neatly and set it aside. Then she looked toward the distant orchard where the entire affair had begun. A peaceful place again now. But Miss Marple knew that human nature, whether in a quiet English village or among the governments of powerful nations, rarely changed very much. Secrets tempted the greedy. Fear silenced the cautious. And sometimes, when both forces collided, the result could echo far beyond the quiet shade of an apple tree. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her shawl, rose from her chair, and returned slowly to the cottage, leaving the village of St. Lydian once more to its peaceful routines, though perhaps with just a little more awareness of the dangerous truths that could hide behind even the most ordinary garden party.